My daughter-in-law started making rules in my own house. What I could eat, where I could sit, when I could speak. No one even asked me. My son said nothing watching her pack my life into boxes. He thought I was just a tired old man who would quietly fade away. He forgot who bought the house, who built the empire they were trying to steal, and just how ruthlessly I could take it all back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon. I had just driven back from the pharmacy, my joints aching a bit more than usual from the damp chill in the air. At 68, you start to notice the cold settling into your bones in a way it never did before. As I turned my truck onto the familiar oak-lined street of my neighborhood, I was just looking forward to a hot cup of black coffee and a quiet evening in my favorite leather armchair. But as I pulled into the wide paved driveway of my home, the estate I had purchased in full 30 years ago, my foot slammed on the brake. Sitting there right on the curb, completely exposed to the torrential downpour, was my bed. It was not just any bed. It was the massive custom-built oak bed frame that I had crafted with my own two hands, alongside my late wife Diane the year we moved in. Every groove in that wood held a memory of her. Beside it, rapidly soaking up gallons of muddy rainwater, was the $2,000 orthotic mattress my doctor had specifically ordered for my back. The expensive fabric was already ruined, stained dark with dirty water pooling from the street gutters. For a moment, I just sat in the driver's seat, the windshield wipers slapping rhythmically back and forth. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. I stepped out of the truck, the freezing rain immediately soaking through my wool coat. I walked toward the curb, my boots splashing in the puddles, and ran my hand along the slick, wet oak of the headboard. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. I turned my gaze up the long driveway toward the front door. It was propped wide open. There, standing on the covered porch, perfectly dry, and holding a clipboard, was Amanda, my 31-year-old daughter-in-law. She was aggressively pointing a manicured finger directing two burly men in matching moving company uniforms, who were carrying out my vintage mahogany bedside tables. I marched up the driveway, the rain plastering my gray hair to my forehead. Amanda spotted me, but her expression did not soften. There was no flash of guilt, no hesitation. She simply adjusted her designer cardigan and let out a long, exasperated sigh, as if my arrival was a minor inconvenience in her busy schedule. I asked her, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady, what exactly she thought she was doing. Amanda did not even look up from her clipboard. She casually explained that her online following was growing, and she desperately needed the master bedroom for her lifestyle influencer video shoots. According to her, the lighting in my room, the room Diane and I had shared for decades, was simply the only acceptable aesthetic for her morning routines. She said my heavy dark furniture was depressing and completely ruined the minimalist vibe she was going for. When I asked where my belongings were going, she waved a dismissive hand toward the side of the house. She told me my things were already downstairs, in the basement. I pushed past her, stepping into the warm, dry foyer of my own home. I was looking for him. Matthew, my 34-year-old son. The boy I had raised, protected, and provided for his entire life. I found him standing in the kitchen, aggressively wiping down a completely clean granite countertop, with a rag, pretending not to hear the commotion. I called his name. He flinched. He slowly turned around, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked everywhere but at my face. He looked at the floor, the ceiling, the stainless steel refrigerator. I waited for him to speak. I waited for my son to defend me, to tell his wife that they could not throw his elderly father out of his own bedroom and leave his most treasured possessions to rot in the street. Instead, Matthew let out a nervous little chuckle. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered that it was just temporary. He told me to just go with the flow, whispering the phrase that makes my blood run cold: happy wife, happy life. He actually had the audacity to pat my wet shoulder and tell me that the basement had plenty of space. He offered no defense, no apology, just cowardly compliance. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and realized the boy I had raised was gone, replaced by a weak, hollow man who would rather watch his father be humiliated than face an uncomfortable conversation with his spoiled wife. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. I simply nodded slowly, my face an unreadable mask. I turned on my heel, water dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floor, and walked to the basement door. Opening it, a blast of damp, musty air hit my face. The basement was completely unfinished. Exposed concrete walls, a single flickering fluorescent bulb, hanging by a wire, and a floor that smelled faintly of old mildew. My clothes, my books. The framed photographs of Diane were all shoved haphazardly into cheap cardboard boxes and stacked precariously against the cold concrete. In the corner, an old lumpy futon had been unfolded. This was my new bed. I sat down on the edge of the futon, the springs groaning in protest. I sat in the dim light and listened to the heavy footsteps of the movers upstairs, dismantling the rest of my life. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully dominated a helpless, frail old man who had no choice but to accept their cruelty. They had moved in 6 months ago, claiming they were desperate to save money for a down payment on a house of their own. I had taken them in rent-free out of the goodness of my heart. But as I sat in that cold basement, a slow, dark realization settled over me. Matthew and Amanda had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because what they did not know, what I had never felt the need to brag about, was that I was not just some retired warehouse worker living on a fixed pension. I did not just work at a logistics company. I built it from the ground up, owned it, and sold it for millions. I owned every single brick, every blade of grass, every inch of this $1.2 million estate free and clear. My name was the only one on the deed. I had resources they could not even begin to fathom. I decided right then, in the cold dampness of the cellar, that I was going to let them play their little game. I was going to let them feel powerful, because the higher they climbed on their pedestal of arrogance, the harder the fall was going to be. The next morning, the physical toll of sleeping on a cheap futon was evident. My back was stiff, my shoulders ached, and I felt the chill deep in my chest. I walked up the wooden stairs to the kitchen, intending to brew my usual pot of dark roast coffee. When I entered the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. The entire room had been rearranged. My coffee maker was gone, replaced by an elaborate, absurdly expensive espresso machine that looked like a spaceship. The pantry had been cleared of my food. But what truly caught my attention was the refrigerator. Stuck directly in the center of the stainless steel door, held up by a perfectly aligned magnet, was a brightly colored laminated sheet of paper. The bold, stylized header read, "House Rules for a High-Vibe Environment." I put my reading glasses on and read down the list. Rule number 1 stated that absolutely no meat or dairy was to be cooked in the kitchen, as Amanda was transitioning her brand to a strict vegan aesthetic, and the smell was deeply triggering to her aura. Rule number 2 dictated that the main living room was strictly off-limits to me after 6 in the evening, as that was her designated time to film content and unwind, without, as she put it, negative generational energy. I read through the curfews, the noise restrictions, the absurd limitations placed upon me in the very house I had paid for. But it was the final rule at the bottom of the page that made a cold, sharp laugh catch in my throat. Rule number 5. Because Amanda and Matthew were generously allowing me to share their space, I was required to contribute an $800 monthly utility share. And directly below that demand, printed in bold black ink, was Amanda's personal Venmo handle. I pulled the laminated paper off the fridge. I stood there in the silent kitchen, holding the demand for rent in my own $1 million home. I traced my thumb over the glossy paper. I did not feel sorrow anymore. The grief of betrayal had completely evaporated, replaced by an absolute icy clarity. They wanted to treat me like a tenant. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, exile me to the dark, and siphon my money to fund their delusions of grandeur. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the banking app connected to an account containing more money than Matthew and Amanda would see in a lifetime. I typed in her Venmo handle. I typed in $800, and I hit send. Let her have the money. Let her feel like the queen of the castle. Because I knew exactly what my next move was going to be. And by the time I was finished, she would not just be out of my house. She would be begging for a place to sleep. The soft chime of the banking application on my phone felt incredibly loud in the absolute silence of the basement. I watched the screen confirm that $800 had been successfully transferred to Amanda. I did not lock my phone immediately. I just stared at the glowing receipt in the dim light. To them, that notification was a victory bell. To me, it was the sound of a trap snapping perfectly into place. If you are going to dismantle someone who believes they are smarter than you cannot fight them. You have to agree with them. You have to lean into their delusion. I knew that if I put up a fight over the money, they would put up their defenses. They would start locking doors, hiding their mail, and questioning my motives. But by handing over the cash without a single word of protest, I bought myself the one thing I needed most: invisibility. The next morning, I began the performance. I rummaged through my unpacked boxes and found an old oversized gray sweater that made my shoulders look slumped and frail. I made sure to walk up the basement stairs a little slower than usual, letting my foot drag just a fraction of an inch on each wooden step. When I entered the kitchen, Amanda was already there, holding her phone on a tripod. She turned around, annoyed that her recording had been interrupted, but then she saw me. She saw the slumped shoulders. She saw my eyes looking down at the floor tiles instead of challenging her. And then she remembered her bank account. A slow, incredibly smug smile spread across her face. She actually poured me a cup of the cheap drip coffee she had bought specifically for me, completely separate from her expensive espresso beans. She handed it to me and thanked me for the utility share in a voice dripping with condescension. She told me it was good to see I was finally taking responsibility for my footprint in the household. I took the mug with trembling hands. I thanked her. I mumbled something about not wanting to be a burden and slowly shuffled back toward the basement door. I could feel her eyes on my back, full of triumphant pity. Over the next few weeks, the consequences of my submission became wildly apparent. The $800 was supposed to be my contribution to the household utilities. That was the lie they told me and the lie they told themselves to justify extorting a 68-year-old man. But I spent 40 years running a logistics company. I know how to track supply chains, and I certainly know how to track cash flow. The money never went to the electric company. It never went to the water bill or the property taxes. It went directly to the front porch. It started with small packages. Cardboard boxes from high-end vegan skincare brands would arrive daily. Then came the home decor. Amanda was obsessed with this neutral beige aesthetic for her videos. Every trace of the colorful, vibrant life Diane and I had built in this house was systematically erased and replaced with dead, colorless objects. One afternoon, I watched from the crack in the basement door as 3 delivery men struggled to carry a massive, absurdly heavy marble coffee table into the living room. It replaced the beautiful cherry wood table Diane had bought at an antique auction in Charleston. The next day, it was expensive pampas grass arrangements, beige linen curtains that cost a fortune, and neutral-toned rugs that stained the moment you stepped on them. She was funding her influencer fantasy, using the money she squeezed out of me. She was buying props to convince strangers on the internet that she was a successful, wealthy wife, while the man who actually owned the roof over her head slept on a lumpy futon downstairs. I watched her film her little videos in my living room. I would stand in the hallway, perfectly hidden in the shadows, listening to her lie to a camera lens. She would hold up a tiny glass bottle of facial serum that cost over $200 and tell her followers that she believed in treating herself because she worked so hard to maintain her beautiful home. She would pan the camera around the room, showing off the architectural details of the house I built, claiming it was her sanctuary. It took everything in my power not to laugh out loud. But what fascinated me more than Amanda's narcissism was Matthew's complete moral collapse. My son was living in a house of cards, and he knew it. I would see him late at night sitting at the kitchen island, bathed in the blue light of his laptop screen. He looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes, his hair was thinning, and he jumped every time the refrigerator compressor turned on. He saw the packages arriving. He saw the expensive marble tables and the silk robes his wife was parading around in. But he never said a word. He was terrified of her. He was terrified of the conflict. He was a coward who had decided that throwing his father to the wolves was an acceptable price to pay for temporary peace in his marriage. One morning the facade cracked just a little bit. I was walking up to get my mail, maintaining my slow, frail walk. The mail carrier handed me a stack of envelopes. Because my name was still on the mailbox, I sorted through them. Right in the middle of the pile was a notice from the city water department. The envelope was bright pink. I slipped it into my pocket and took it downstairs to the basement. I opened it under the harsh fluorescent light. It was a final shut-off notice. The water bill had not been paid in 3 months. The outstanding balance was roughly $400. I sat on the edge of my futon and stared at the pink paper. Amanda had demanded $800 from me on the first of the month for utilities. She had looked me dead in the eye and taken that money under the guise of paying the household bills. And yet the water was about to be turned off. A normal person would have marched upstairs, slammed the pink notice on the marble counter, and demanded an explanation. A normal person would have screamed at them for their financial negligence. But I am not a normal person, and I do not react. I calculate. If I confronted them about the bill, it would shatter the illusion of my submission. Amanda would realize I was checking the mail and paying attention to the finances. She would realize I was not just a senile old man wasting away in the basement. I could not risk waking them up. So I picked up my phone. I logged into my private bank account, the one they knew nothing about, the one with a balance that would make Amanda faint. I paid the $400 water bill in full. I paid it quietly, invisibly, leaving absolutely no trace. I kept their water running so Amanda could take her hour-long aesthetic milk baths for her videos. I kept the lights on so Matthew could stay up all night staring at his spreadsheets in a panic. I financed their delusion to keep them exactly where I wanted them. Comfortable, arrogant, and completely unprepared. By the third month, the $800 was no longer enough for her. The greed of someone who gets money for nothing is a bottomless pit. She cornered me in the hallway one afternoon, blocking my path to the kitchen. She gave me a fake, sympathetic smile. She sighed dramatically and said that inflation was really hitting the grocery bills hard. She claimed her special organic vegan meal plans were getting expensive, and since I was using the electricity in the basement, it was only fair that my utility share went up. She asked for an even $1,000 a month. She did not ask. She demanded it wrapped up in polite influencer jargon. I looked at her. I made sure my hands trembled just a little bit as I reached into my pocket for my phone. I lowered my voice to a whisper and told her that things were tight for me on my fixed income, but I wanted to make sure they were supported. I opened the Venmo application right in front of her. I typed in $1,000. I hit send. The chime echoed in the hallway. Amanda beamed. She actually reached out and patted my arm, treating me like a well-trained dog who had just performed a trick. She told me she appreciated my cooperation and immediately turned around, tapping away on her phone to undoubtedly buy another piece of useless beige furniture. I stood in the hallway alone, dropping the frail posture for just a second. I straightened my back. My shoulders squared. The ache in my joints vanished, replaced by the electric thrill of a hunter watching his prey walk directly into a cage. They thought they were bleeding me dry. They thought I was a pathetic old man handing over my meager pension just to keep a roof over my head. Every dollar they took from me was another brick they were laying in the wall of their own prison. I was not giving them rent. I was giving them evidence. Every Venmo receipt, every unpaid pink utility notice, every designer box that landed on that front porch was being meticulously documented in my mind. I was letting Amanda gorge herself on my apparent weakness. I was letting her aesthetic lifestyle inflate like a giant, delicate balloon. Because very soon I was going to be the one holding the needle. It was a Friday night when the noise finally became unbearable. The heavy bass of a pretentious lounge playlist vibrated fiercely through the exposed floorboards directly above my futon. Amanda was hosting her first official dinner party since transforming my home into her personal film set. I could hear the sharp clinking of crystal wine glasses and the exaggerated laughter of people who were desperately trying to impress one another. The party had been going on for hours. My throat was bone dry. I had developed a slight cough, the kind that settles deep into your chest when you spend too much time breathing in cold, damp basement air. I needed water to take my evening medication. I did not want to go upstairs and break her ridiculous curfew. I knew the rules she had so arrogantly placed on the refrigerator, but the thirst was overwhelming. I put on my worn-out slippers and slowly climbed the creaking wooden stairs. When I opened the heavy door to the kitchen, the sheer volume of the gathering hit me like a physical force. There were at least 20 strangers standing in my living room and kitchen area. The women were dressed in sleek, neutral-toned dresses, constantly holding their phones up to record the evening and each other. The men wore expensive watches and perfectly tailored jackets, swirling their drinks with practiced arrogance. The entire space smelled of heavy designer perfume and roasted garlic. It looked completely alien to me. The vibrant, warm home Diane and I had built was entirely gone, replaced by this sterile, beige showroom. I kept my head down, trying to slip unnoticed along the wall to reach the kitchen sink. I just wanted to fill my small plastic cup and disappear back into the floorboards before anyone noticed my presence. But Amanda possesses the predatory vision of a hawk when she senses an opportunity to gain attention. She was standing near the massive marble coffee table she had purchased using my money, holding a glass of expensive white wine. She saw me creeping along the wall. The room was loud, but her voice cut through the chatter with a practiced, piercing precision. She called out my name, her tone dripping with a sickeningly sweet, artificial warmth that made my stomach turn. The conversation in the room ground to an immediate halt. 20 pairs of eyes turned to look at the frail, gray-haired man standing awkwardly by the sink in an oversized sweater and scuffed slippers. I froze in place, gripping my empty plastic cup. Amanda walked confidently toward me, parting the sea of her guests, motioning for everyone to look in my direction. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. She looked back at her friends, her eyes wide with manufactured empathy. She told them that they had to forgive the minor interruption. She then introduced me to the room. She did not introduce me as her father-in-law. She did not introduce me as the man who had built the very walls standing around them. She introduced me as her charity case tenant. She actually used those exact words to describe me. She explained to this room of wealthy strangers that she and Matthew had found me struggling to survive on a meager fixed income. She spun a beautiful, tragic, and entirely fabricated story about how they simply could not bear to see an elderly man end up on the street. She claimed they took me in out of the sheer kindness of their hearts, giving me a safe place to sleep downstairs so I would not freeze in the winter. A collective sigh of adoration swept through the crowded room. The guests looked at Amanda as if she were a saint walking among mortals. A woman in a pale silk dress raised her glass and praised Amanda aloud for having such a beautiful, generous soul. Another guest pulled out their phone and actually asked if they could take a picture of us for their social media story to promote elder care awareness in the community. Amanda smiled modestly, waving her hand and telling them it was nothing. She told them that giving back to the less fortunate was just a core pillar of her personal brand values. I looked past Amanda's shoulder and saw my son. Matthew was standing by the fireplace, gripping his cocktail glass so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. He looked sick to his stomach. He knew the truth. He knew I owned the house, the land, and the money funding this entire charade. But he did not say a single word. He simply stared at the floor. He let his wife publicly strip away his father's dignity to score cheap internet points with a room full of superficial strangers. The rage that flared inside my chest was blinding and absolute. It took every ounce of discipline I had cultivated over 40 years of cutthroat business negotiations, not to crush the plastic cup in my hand. I wanted to stand up straight, look these arrogant children in the eye, and tell them that my private bank account could buy their entire lives 10 times over. I wanted to throw them all out into the rain right then and there, but I remembered the plan. I remembered the trap I was carefully setting. If I spoke up now, I would ruin the masterpiece of vengeance I was building. If I showed my true strength, they would run. So I forced my shoulders to slump even further. I let my hand shake visibly as I raised the cup to the faucet. I looked at the crowd of influencers with wide, pathetic eyes. I nodded meekly at them. I mumbled a quiet, trembling thank you to Amanda, telling her she was very kind to let an old man stay in her beautiful home. The guests cooed with deep sympathy. Amanda beamed, soaking up the validation like a sponge, completely oblivious to the venom behind my performance. I filled my cup with cold tap water, turned around, and began the slow, humiliating walk back to the basement door. They watched me retreat, treating me as nothing more than a living prop in Amanda's elaborate stage play. As I closed the heavy basement door behind me, the loud chatter and laughter immediately resumed upstairs. They had already forgotten about my existence. I walked down the dark stairs and sat back down on my lumpy futon. I drank the cold water in the dark, listening to the heavy footsteps above my head. The humiliation tasted incredibly bitter, but I swallowed it down with a smile. Let them take their pictures. Let her play the benevolent savior. Because the higher she built this false pedestal of charity and wealth, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally kicked the pillar out from under her. The morning after the dinner party, the house was dead quiet. The air upstairs still carried the faint and sour smell of spilled wine and heavy perfume. I woke up before dawn, my back aching from the lumpy futon, and decided to organize some of the boxes I had not yet unpacked. The basement was my only remaining sanctuary, the one place Amanda refused to enter because the lighting was too poor, and the concrete walls did not fit her pristine aesthetic. As I walked past the exposed water heater in the back corner of the room, my foot brushed against something metallic on the cold floor. I looked down. It was a small bent piece of silver metal. I immediately recognized what it was, and a cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. I moved quickly behind a stack of thick cardboard boxes to the spot where I kept a small gray steel filing cabinet. It was an old cabinet I had used in my home office for decades to keep important family documents safe. I had explicitly locked it before the movers shoved it down here. The top drawer was hanging open about an inch. I stepped closer, the dim fluorescent bulb casting long shadows across the gray metal. The lock had not just been picked, it had been brutally forced. The steel around the keyhole was deeply gouged and heavily scratched, the gray paint scraped away to reveal the shiny raw metal underneath. Someone had taken a heavy flathead screwdriver and violently pried the lock mechanism apart until the internal tumbler snapped entirely. That was the piece of metal I had stepped on. I slowly pulled the heavy drawer open. The thick manila folders inside were a complete mess. My careful alphabetical organization was destroyed. Papers were shoved back in haphazardly, some bent and crumpled at the edges. They had gone through absolutely everything. My old tax returns, the original blueprints for the house from 30 years ago, and even Diane's final medical records. I stood there, in the damp chill of the basement, tracing my finger over the ruined lock. This was no longer just about Amanda wanting a prettier bedroom for her videos. This was not just about Matthew being too weak to stand up to his greedy wife. This was a targeted physical violation of my space and my history. They had crept down the wooden stairs like common thieves carrying tools into my private area. They were hunting. They were desperately searching for life insurance policies, old bank statements, or the original deed to the property. They wanted to know exactly what I was worth and what legal avenues they had to take it all from me. A deep and terrifying calm washed over me. Any lingering trace of paternal guilt I might have still harbored for my son vanished entirely in that exact second. When someone breaks the lock on your life and violates the memories of your dead wife, they forfeit the right to be treated as family. I carefully pushed the heavy steel drawer shut, leaving it exactly as damaged as I had found it. I wanted them to think they got away with it. I wanted them to think I was simply too old and too blind to notice a broken lock. They were desperately looking for leverage, and I knew exactly how I was going to use that desperation to destroy them. 2 days after I discovered the ruined lock on my basement filing cabinet, the real attack began. It was early on a Thursday morning, and the house was completely silent. The heavy gray clouds outside cast a dull light across the massive marble island in the kitchen. I was sitting on one of the expensive beige bar stools Amanda had purchased with my money, eating a simple bowl of oatmeal. I preferred the quiet of the early morning, before the influencer circus upstairs began its daily broadcast. I was staring out the large glass windows at the wet lawn when I heard the heavy wooden door of the master bedroom open and close. Footsteps moved quickly down the hallway. It was Matthew. This was incredibly unusual. My son had never been a morning person, and since he had taken out that massive hidden business loan, he usually stayed up until 3 in the morning, staring at his computer screen, and slept until noon. But today he was fully dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks. He walked into the kitchen, and I immediately noticed the physical changes in his demeanor. His face was pale and slightly damp with sweat. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding my gaze entirely. He moved with a nervous, jittery energy, like a man walking up to a cliff edge and trying to convince himself to jump. He walked over to the absurdly complicated espresso machine and began loudly making himself a cup of coffee. He was trying too hard to appear casual. He asked me how I was sleeping down in the basement and if the dampness was bothering my joints. The false concern in his voice was thick and nauseating. I simply nodded and told him I was managing just fine. He took a sip of his coffee and walked over to the kitchen island, pulling out the bar stool next to mine. He sat down and placed a thick manila envelope onto the cold marble surface. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and began to complain about the economy. He talked about inflation and how hard it was for young couples to save for a mortgage these days. He was laying the groundwork for a pitch. I recognized the strategy immediately because I had used similar tactics during corporate negotiations 40 years ago when I needed to soften up a stubborn vendor. But Matthew was clumsy. He was rushing the pacing. He slid the manila envelope across the marble counter until it rested right next to my bowl of oatmeal. He cleared his throat and told me that his accountant had suggested a new strategy to help them with their taxes. He explained that since I was living in the house and contributing that $1,000 monthly utility share, the government could technically classify our living arrangement in a way that offered significant tax deductions for the entire household. He called it a standard cohabitation tax document. He said it was just a routine piece of bureaucratic paperwork that the city required to prove we were sharing the financial burden of the property. He promised it would end up saving all of us a substantial amount of money by the end of the fiscal year. I looked at the envelope and then I looked at my son. I know Matthew better than he knows himself. When he was 7 years old, he broke a neighbor window with a baseball and tried to blame it on the wind. When he lied, his left foot always tapped rapidly against the floor and his breathing became shallow. Right now, under the counter, his leather shoe was violently tapping against the brass footrest of the bar stool. He was terrified. I wiped my mouth with the napkin and slowly reached for the envelope. I opened the metal clasp and pulled out the stack of papers inside. The first thing I noticed was the weight of the paper itself. It was thick, premium legal bond stock. Routine city tax forms are printed on cheap, lightweight paper. This was the kind of paper used by expensive law firms to draft permanent binding agreements. I pulled my cheap reading glasses out of my chest pocket and slid them onto my nose. I looked at the first page. It did not have a government tax seal at the top. It did not ask for my social security number or my annual income. The formatting was dense, consisting of solid blocks of text, written in complex legal terminology. My eyes scanned the first heavy black paragraph. I saw the word grantor printed in bold letters next to my full legal name, Lawrence Barrett. I felt a cold, heavy stone drop perfectly into the center of my stomach. I kept reading, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I scanned down to the next section and found the word grantee. Next to that word was not the name of the city tax authority. It was the name of a private entity called the Amanda Barrett Irrevocable Lifestyle Trust. I read the central clause of the document. It stated that for the consideration of $1, the grantor was relinquishing all past, present, and future claims of ownership to the property located at my exact home address. It stated that the title and all associated equity were to be immediately and permanently transferred to the grantee. Matthew was not handing me a tax document. My 34-year-old son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle on this very driveway, the boy whose college tuition I had paid in full, was sitting next to me trying to trick me into signing a quitclaim deed. He was trying to steal my house. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal echoed in my mind like a gunshot. They had broken into my basement filing cabinet, realized they could not find the original deed, and decided to simply forge a new legal path by weaponizing my presumed ignorance. They assumed I was just a tired old man who would blindly sign whatever paper his son put in front of him just to be helpful. They wanted to take the $1.2 million estate I had built with my bare hands and transfer it entirely into a trust controlled by Amanda. Once my signature was on that paper and notarized, they could legally evict me the very next day. I would have absolutely zero recourse. I would be homeless, and they would own everything. I sat there staring at the dense black text. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for an eternity. I did not feel rage. Rage is a hot, uncontrollable emotion that makes you reckless. What I felt was an absolute freezing void. In that exact moment, the father-son bond completely shattered. The man sitting next to me was no longer my child. He was an active, hostile threat to my survival. He was a thief trying to steal the roof from over my head and leave me to die in the cold. Matthew could not handle the silence anymore. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. He clicked the top, exposing the ink cartridge, and pushed it across the marble counter toward my hand. He leaned in close, his voice shaking slightly. He told me that I just needed to sign my name at the very bottom of the second page and date it. He said he had a friend at the bank who was a notary public and could stamp it later, so I did not even have to worry about leaving the house. He forced a strained smile and told me it was just a quick formality so he could get it to the accountant before the weekend. He was pushing me. The desperation in his voice was palpable. If I refused to sign it right now, he would know that I understood what the document really was. The entire illusion of my frail submission would vanish. The trap I was building would fall apart, and they would immediately start looking for other malicious ways to destroy me financially. I had to defuse the bomb without letting him know I had seen the wiring. I looked at the silver pen resting on the counter. Then I slowly took off my reading glasses. I squeezed my eyes shut tight and brought my trembling hands up to massage my temples. I let out a long, frustrated sigh. I blinked rapidly, staring at the document, as if the words were completely blurred together. I pushed the paper back across the counter just a few inches. I looked at Matthew with a perfect expression of elderly confusion and defeat. I told him that I was incredibly sorry, but my vision had deteriorated terribly over the past few weeks. I said that the letters on the page looked like a swarm of black ants moving around, and that my cheap pharmacy glasses were simply not working anymore. I kept my voice low and vulnerable, playing the pathetic burden to absolute perfection. Matthew panicked. He quickly grabbed the paper and tried to point at the signature line. He told me that I did not need to read the whole thing, because he had already explained it to me. He said I just needed to put my name on the line he was pointing at. He was practically begging me to just blindly sign away my entire net worth. I shook my head slowly, acting deeply embarrassed by my own physical limitations. I told him that my late wife Diane always made me promise never to sign any financial document unless I could read every single word myself. I told him it was just a stubborn old habit I could not break. I reached out and gently pulled the quitclaim deed out of his hands. I folded the thick legal paper directly in half and then folded it again, pressing the creases down firmly. I slid the folded document into the deep pocket of my wool cardigan. I told Matthew that I was going to call the optometrist and schedule an emergency appointment to get a proper prescription for new reading glasses tomorrow morning. I promised him that as soon as I had my new glasses and could see the text clearly, I would review the tax forms and sign them for him. Matthew sat completely frozen on the bar stool. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He could not forcefully demand the papers back without acting incredibly suspicious. He could not tell me that reading it was unnecessary without revealing his true intentions. He was entirely trapped by his own lie. He had presented it as a casual, unimportant tax form, and now he had to pretend that a delay did not matter. I stood up from the bar stool, leaning heavily on the marble counter for support. I picked up my empty bowl of oatmeal and carried it to the sink. I thanked him for helping me with my taxes and told him he was a good son for looking out for my finances. The irony of those words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I delivered them with absolute sincerity. I turned my back on him and began the slow, shuffling walk toward the basement door. I could feel his eyes burning a hole through my back. He was furious, frustrated, and completely helpless. He had come within inches of stealing my entire life, and I had slipped right through his fingers, using nothing but a pair of cheap glasses and an excuse about bad eyesight. As I closed the heavy basement door behind me and descended into the dark, I reached into my pocket and felt the thick folded paper. They had crossed the point of no return. They had tried to legally execute me. Now I had the physical evidence of their felony fraud resting comfortably in my pocket. I did not need an optometrist. I needed an attorney. The silent adjustment was over. It was time to prepare the guillotine. I waited until I heard the heavy front door click shut and the engine of the luxury leased vehicle belonging to Amanda fade down the street. She was taking Matthew to some pretentious organic brunch spot to film a weekend lifestyle video for her internet followers. The moment the house was completely empty, I dropped the frail posture entirely. I walked to the hall closet and bypassed the oversized gray sweater I had been using as my pathetic costume. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a tailored charcoal wool suit I had not worn since I sold my logistics company 5 years ago. I slipped it on and tied a perfect knot in my dark silk tie. I looked in the tall mirror in the hallway. The pathetic charity case tenant they had created was completely gone. The man staring back at me in the glass was a corporate predator who had built a massive multi-million-dollar empire from absolutely nothing. I walked out the front door and got into my heavy-duty truck. I did not drive to an optometrist to get new reading glasses. I drove straight into the heart of the downtown financial district. I navigated through the busy streets and pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper. I took the private, secure elevator all the way up to the 42nd floor. The polished steel doors slid open silently to reveal the expansive reception area of Foster & Associates. This was not some cheap storefront law office that dealt with petty neighborhood disputes or minor traffic violations. This was a premier corporate litigation and estate management firm. The floors were covered in imported Italian marble, and the walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany wood. The air smelled of expensive leather and absolute power. The receptionist was a young professional woman in a sharp blazer who recognized me immediately. She stood up straight and greeted me with absolute respect, addressing me formally by my last name. She did not offer me cheap drip coffee or look at me with the sickening pity I received at my own house. She immediately escorted me down the long, quiet hallway, past several glass conference rooms to the main corner office. I walked through the heavy oak double doors and saw Aaron Foster standing behind a massive modern glass desk. Aaron was a ruthless, highly connected estate litigator. We had done business together for nearly 20 years. He was the man who had helped me structure my early corporate acquisitions, and he knew exactly how much wealth and power I truly held. He walked around his desk and shook my hand firmly, looking me directly in the eye like an equal. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. The silence in his office was thick and entirely professional. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the folded legal document Matthew had tried to force me to sign that morning in the kitchen. I placed the thick paper onto the smooth glass surface of the desk and slid it toward Aaron. I told him that my son and my daughter-in-law had attempted to present this document to me as a standard city tax form for household cohabitation. I watched closely as Aaron put on his reading glasses and picked up the thick paper. Aaron Foster is a man who rarely shows any visible emotion. He has seen every possible variation of corporate greed, family betrayal, and financial manipulation imaginable. But as his eyes scanned the dense black text of the quitclaim deed, I saw his jaw tighten slightly. He read the central clause attempting to transfer the entire ownership of my $1.2 million estate into an irrevocable trust controlled entirely by Amanda. He placed the paper back onto the glass desk and looked at me. His voice was incredibly cold and precise when he spoke. He confirmed what I already knew deep in my gut. He told me that this was a completely fraudulent and highly illegal attempt to strip me of my primary real estate asset. He pointed a silver pen at the signature line and the blank notary section, noting that if I had actually signed it, my family would have legally robbed me blind and thrown me onto the street. I nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of the situation. I told Aaron that I needed a complete forensic audit of their entire financial existence starting from the day they moved into my house. I told him I wanted to know every single dollar they had spent, every hidden debt they owed, and every dark secret they were desperately trying to cover up. I explicitly authorized him to pull the banking records from the joint emergency account I still shared with Matthew from his college days, so we could trace the routing numbers. I told Aaron to deploy his premier forensic accounting team immediately because I needed to know exactly why my son was suddenly desperate enough to attempt a major felony against his own father. Aaron did not waste a single second debating the issue. He pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his lead financial investigator into the corner office. For the next 3 solid hours, I sat in that leather chair drinking dark black coffee while Aaron and his team went to work. They completely bypassed the superficial social media profiles and dug directly into the raw encrypted financial data. They pulled deep credit reports, they traced hidden routing numbers, and they cross-referenced public corporate filings. The large digital screen in the adjacent conference room lit up with complex spreadsheets and banking histories. The grand illusion of the perfect, successful life my son and his wife projected to the world was being systematically dissected under a merciless microscope. The first major anomaly they found hit the digital screen about an hour into the deep audit. The lead investigator brought up a commercial lending file. I leaned forward in my leather chair. Matthew had always told me his new technology startup company was thriving. He claimed he had secured wealthy angel investors and was on the verge of a massive corporate buyout. He used that grand narrative to justify why he and his wife needed to live with me rent-free so they could save their liquid cash for a massive down payment on a luxury home. The detailed spreadsheet on the screen told a completely different and entirely pathetic story. Matthew did not have any wealthy angel investors. His technology startup was completely bankrupt. The company operating accounts were entirely drained and running a negative balance. But that was not the worst part of the revelation. The lead investigator highlighted a massive commercial loan that had been issued just 8 months ago. It was a high-risk business loan from a predatory secondary lending institution. The principal amount listed on the screen was exactly $250,000. I stared at the massive number glowing on the screen. $250,000. Matthew had taken out a massive, staggering debt right around the same time they begged to move into my damp basement. But predatory secondary lenders do not simply hand over that kind of money to a failing technology startup without securing significant collateral. I asked Aaron how my son could possibly qualify for a business loan of that magnitude without any tangible real estate assets or liquid capital to his name. Aaron pulled up the original scanned loan application document and projected it onto the large screen. He magnified the final page, specifically focusing on the section containing the guarantor signatures. I felt the air leave my lungs completely. Right there on the bottom line next to the signature of my son was my own full legal name, Lawrence Barrett. Someone had perfectly forged my signature to guarantee a $250,000 commercial loan. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place inside my mind. Matthew was not just trying to steal my house to please the aesthetic demands of his greedy wife. He was drowning in $250,000 of fraudulent debt. The loan term was coming due, and the predatory bank was undoubtedly demanding immediate payment or threatening to seize the collateral. Matthew knew perfectly well that if the bank came after me to collect the massive debt, the amateur forgery would be immediately exposed, and he would face federal prison time for wire fraud and identity theft. He was desperately trying to force me to sign the quitclaim deed so he could take total ownership of my $1 million estate and use the home equity to secretly pay off the fraudulent loan before I ever found out about his massive failure. He was fully willing to make his own elderly father homeless just to cover up his criminal incompetence. The betrayal I felt was so deep and so absolute that it transcended any normal human anger. I was looking directly at the digital footprint of a son who had completely sacrificed his father on the altar of his own cowardice. He had smiled at me over a bowl of oatmeal while actively plotting to leave me with absolutely nothing to my name. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my racing heart and asked Aaron to show me the personal financial profile belonging to Amanda. If Matthew was drowning in commercial debt, I needed to see exactly where my $1,000 a month in utility rent was actually going. The investigator switched the conference screen from corporate lending filings to personal consumer credit reports. If the business finances of my son were a tragic criminal failure, the personal finances of his wife were an absolute circus of narcissistic delusion. The large screen immediately filled with a cascading waterfall of red negative numbers. Amanda portrayed herself on the internet as a wealthy, highly successful lifestyle influencer who only purchased the finest organic products and high-end designer furniture. Her followers truly believed she was living a life of pristine luxury and effortless wealth. The reality hidden in the financial data was a catastrophic mountain of high-interest consumer debt. The investigator pulled up her active credit card statements one by one. She had 6 different premium credit cards maxed out to their absolute spending limits. The total revolving debt was utterly staggering. She owed over $120,000 in personal credit card debt alone. The detailed, itemized lists of her purchases were pathetic to read. I saw thousands of dollars spent at high-end cosmetic injection clinics, thousands more spent on imported beige linen clothing, and massive recurring charges from luxury furniture retailers. She was paying 25% interest on fake marble tables and tiny bottles of organic skin serums. The $1,000 I was sending her every month through the phone application was barely covering the minimum monthly interest payments on her massive credit card balances. She was completely broke. Her entire online persona was exclusively funded by plastic credit cards she could never possibly hope to pay off in her lifetime. She was throwing loud dinner parties for local internet influencers and serving expensive white wine while her entire financial world was actively collapsing around her. She was confidently calling me a charity case in front of her wealthy friends while secretly relying on my monthly rent payments, just to keep the aggressive credit card companies from sending collection agents to my front door. I sat back heavily in my leather chair and looked at the 2 disastrous financial profiles displayed side by side on the large digital screen. A $250,000 fraudulent commercial loan, a $120,000 mountain of luxury consumer debt. My son and my daughter-in-law were locked in a terrifying financial death spiral rapidly approaching nearly $400,000 in toxic unpayable liabilities. They were 2 desperate drowning people clutching blindly at each other, and their only viable plan for survival was to pull me under the dark water with them. They genuinely thought I was blind to their scheme. They genuinely thought I was weak and submissive. They thought I was nothing more than a convenient financial asset they could quickly liquidate to save their own pathetic skins. I looked across the glass desk at Aaron Foster. The cold, heavy silence returned to the law office. Aaron leaned forward and asked me what my explicit instructions were moving forward. He asked me if I wanted him to contact the federal authorities right now and have Matthew arrested for the commercial loan forgery. He noted that it would be incredibly easy to execute. A single phone call from his office to the fraud department of the lending bank would immediately trigger a massive federal investigation and criminal charges. I shook my head slowly, rejecting the idea. Sending Matthew to a federal prison cell right now was simply too quick. It was too quiet and far too private. If I just called the local police, Amanda would immediately play the victim card. She would go straight on the internet and cry to her thousands of followers that her deceptive husband had ruined her life, and she would try to maintain her fake aesthetic lifestyle by begging for sympathy donations. I wanted to completely dismantle their fake facade in a way that left absolutely no room for excuses, lies, or public sympathy. I wanted to burn their false kingdom to the ground entirely in front of the very audience they had built it for. I leaned forward, resting my forearms firmly on the cold glass desk. I told Aaron we were going to let them think they had won the war. I instructed him to begin drafting the legal countermeasures immediately. The quiet phase of the silent adjustment was officially over, and the perfectly orchestrated demolition was about to begin. Aaron Foster leaned back in his heavy leather chair and folded his hands across his chest. He looked at me with the cold, calculating expression of a general planning a surgical military strike. He asked me where I wanted to begin the demolition. I did not hesitate for a single second. I told him to cut the financial lifeline completely. When Matthew was 18 years old and preparing to leave for his first semester of college, I opened a joint emergency banking account at a major national bank. I had personally seeded that account with $50,000 in cash. It was supposed to be a secure safety net, a fatherly insurance policy in case my son ever faced a sudden medical emergency or a catastrophic life crisis. Over the decades, as I built my logistics empire and my wealth grew exponentially, I had completely forgotten about that small account, simply assuming my highly successful son had eventually moved his personal assets to his own private wealth management firm. But the deep forensic audit we had just conducted revealed a pathetic truth. Matthew had not moved anything. He had been quietly and desperately draining that emergency account over the past 6 months, just to make the minimum interest payments on his massive fraudulent commercial loan. There was exactly $14,320 left in the account. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and logged directly into my secure private banking portal right there in the law office. I did not bother transferring the remaining funds to my own primary accounts. That would be too gentle. Instead, I executed a hard security freeze on the joint account, officially reporting it as compromised due to suspected unauthorized activity. I locked the routing numbers down so tightly that neither Matthew nor I could withdraw a single penny without physically standing inside a primary bank branch with 2 forms of government identification and a federal tax notary present. The moment I tapped the confirm button on my glowing screen, Matthew lost his absolute last drop of liquid cash. I sat there and vividly imagined my son sitting in some overpriced organic brunch restaurant with his wife right at that very moment. I pictured him blindly handing a waiter his premium debit card to pay for a $100 plate of avocado toast, completely unaware that the financial guillotine had already dropped in silence. The safety net his father had built for him out of love was officially destroyed, replaced by a cold concrete floor of absolute ruin. When that card declined, the panic would finally begin to set in. But cutting off his pocket change was merely the opening jab. The real target, the absolute center of gravity in this war, was the $1.2 million estate they were actively trying to steal from me. Aaron summoned his two senior paralegals into the corner office. They walked in carrying a thick stack of pristine, meticulously drafted legal documents. This was not the cheap amateur forgery my son had nervously pushed across the kitchen marble counter that morning. This was the real devastating machinery of high-level corporate law. I instructed Aaron to immediately transfer the absolute title, the property deed, and the total financial equity of my home entirely out of my personal name. We created an impenetrable, legally blind corporate trust. We named the holding entity the Barrett Legacy Foundation. By executing this highly specific legal maneuver, I was effectively making myself a legal tenant of my own private corporation. On paper, the man named Lawrence Barrett would no longer own a single brick of that house. A faceless, untouchable legal entity, governed by strict corporate bylaws, would hold the deed in perpetuity. Aaron explained the sheer brilliance and the lethal nature of this counter-move. When Matthew and Amanda eventually took their forged quitclaim deed to the county clerk office to officially file it, the government system would automatically reject it. You cannot quitclaim a residential property you do not personally own, and you certainly cannot forge a signature to steal massive real estate assets from an established corporate foundation without triggering an immediate automatic federal felony investigation for corporate real estate fraud. By signing Aaron documents, I was turning my beautiful home into a hidden legal landmine. The exact moment they tried to step on it and claim it as their own, they would blow their own lives and their freedom to absolute pieces. I sat forward at the smooth glass desk and took the heavy silver fountain pen Aaron offered me. I began to sign my name on page after page. I signed away my personal individual ownership. I signed the massive equity transfer authorizations. I signed the complex tax reallocation forms. With every single firm stroke of the pen, I felt a massive suffocating weight lifting off my tired shoulders. I was not losing my home to them. I was weaponizing the property against them. For the past 6 months, I had allowed them to treat me like a frail, senile burden who was just taking up space. They genuinely thought my silence was a symptom of old age, physical weakness, and mental decline. They never once realized it was the highly disciplined patience of a man who knew exactly how to construct an inescapable, flawless trap. After nearly an hour of reading and signing the dense corporate paperwork, Aaron took the thick stack of executed documents and handed them to his senior legal clerk. He ordered the clerk to leave the building immediately, walk the transfer deed directly to the county courthouse downtown, and file it in person with the city registrar that very afternoon. He demanded that the legal shield be permanently cemented into the public government record before the sun went down today. There would be no loopholes and absolutely no margin for error. With the fortress fully secured and the estate locked away, Aaron leaned forward and asked me how I intended to handle the volatile situation back at the house. I told him I needed to keep them entirely blind to the trap until the absolute perfect moment presented itself. I needed them to feel victorious. I needed Amanda to feel like an absolute queen, so her eventual public humiliation would be total and complete. Aaron smiled a very thin, predatory smile. He understood exactly what I was building. He opened his heavy desk drawer and pulled out a blank sheet of premium legal bond paper. The exact same expensive paper Matthew had used for his pathetic forgery attempt. Aaron called in one of his junior associates, who happened to be a licensed notary public for the state. We did not draft a real legal document. Instead, Aaron took the original forged quitclaim deed I had brought with me, the one Matthew had desperately tried to force me to sign in the kitchen. He placed it directly in front of me. I took my cheap scratched reading glasses out of my pocket and put them on. I picked up a standard ballpoint pen and signed my name at the bottom of the second page. But I did not use my firm corporate signature. I perfectly mimicked the slightly shaky, frail, uneven handwriting of a tired, frightened old man giving up his life. The junior associate then stamped the bottom of the page with a highly official-looking but entirely voided novelty notary seal that Aaron kept on a shelf as a joke paperweight. It looked absolutely perfect to the untrained, arrogant eye. To Amanda, it would look like a fully executed, legally binding surrender of my entire estate. It was in reality a worthless piece of paper that would serve as the ultimate irresistible bait. I slipped the decoy document back into the brown manila envelope and placed it securely aside my jacket pocket. The silent counter move was officially complete. The emergency funds were frozen solid. The house was locked permanently inside a corporate vault. The fake victory paper was perfectly prepared to be delivered. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and shook Aaron's hand firmly. We agreed on the exact timeline for the final devastating strike. I walked out of the quiet law firm and took the private elevator all the way down to the underground parking garage. I got back into my truck and sat in the quiet, isolated cabin for a long time. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I took off the tailored charcoal suit jacket and carefully folded it and hid it behind the passenger seat. I reached into the back and pulled out the oversized, pathetic gray sweater I had been wearing all week. I pulled it over my head. I purposely messed up my hair to look disheveled and tired. I practiced the slight, defeated slump in my shoulders and the vacant, submissive look in my eyes. I was about to walk back into a house occupied by two desperate criminals who thought they were absolute masterminds. They thought they had finally broken me. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I drove back toward the suburbs with a deep, peaceful calm settling over my mind. I was completely ready to hand my arrogant daughter-in-law the exact rope she was going to use to hang herself, and I was going to watch her tie the knot with a smile on my face. I pulled my truck into the driveway and parked next to the luxury vehicle my daughter-in-law leased with money she did not have. I sat in the quiet cabin for a few moments and mentally prepared myself for the final act of this performance. I took off my seatbelt and let out a long breath. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I hunched my shoulders forward and let my spine curve slightly. I slowed my breathing down to mimic the shallow breaths of a man who was physically exhausted by the world. I walked up the concrete steps, dragging my feet just enough to make my heavy boots scuff loudly against the pavement. I pushed open the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house smelled intensely of roasted garlic and expensive organic lavender from whatever trendy brunch spot they had just visited. I could hear their voices echoing from the kitchen. Amanda was speaking rapidly. She was complaining about the natural light in the living room and demanding that they knock down the load-bearing wall near the fireplace to open up the floor plan. I walked slowly down the hallway, making sure the floorboards creaked under my weight so they would know I was approaching. When I entered the kitchen, they both stopped talking immediately. Matthew looked at me with a tight, nervous expression on his face. He was clearly terrified that I had discovered the truth about the legal document he tried to force on me that morning. His eyes darted from my face down to my empty hands and back up again. Amanda simply rolled her eyes and crossed her arms, looking deeply annoyed that my presence had interrupted her grand architectural visions. I kept my eyes focused on the marble floor tiles playing the role of the defeated burden to absolute perfection. I reached into the deep pocket of my oversized gray sweater. My hand trembled slightly on purpose as I pulled out the brown manila envelope. I did not look at Amanda at all. I walked directly toward my son and held the envelope out to him. I forced my voice to sound thin and raspy. I told Matthew that I had gone to the eye doctor just like I promised him I would. I explained that the doctor gave me a temporary pair of heavy prescription reading glasses and that I had finally been able to sit down in a quiet room and read through the tax forms he had given me. Matthew swallowed hard. I could literally see the pulse beating rapidly against the skin of his neck. He reached out with a shaky hand and took the envelope from my grasp. I told him that I completely understood what the paperwork was really for. I said I knew it was meant to protect the house and help them secure their financial future together. I lied to my own son with such absolute sincerity that it almost frightened me. I told him that I had even stopped by the bank on the way home and had one of the tellers notarize my signature just to save him the trouble of doing it later. I said I just wanted to be helpful and make sure they were taken care of. Matthew quickly opened the metal clasp of the envelope and pulled out the thick, premium legal paper. His eyes immediately darted down to the bottom of the second page. He saw my signature perfectly mimicking the frail, uneven handwriting of an old man giving up his life. He saw the bright blue stamp of the fake notary seal we had applied at the law office. The wave of relief that washed over his face was pathetic to witness. His tense shoulders suddenly dropped, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He actually took a step forward and wrapped his arms around me. He hugged me tightly and called me a good father. The sheer hypocrisy of his embrace made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. He was hugging the man he thought he had just successfully robbed and left completely defenseless. But I patted his back gently and told him that I loved him. Amanda, however, did not care about any sentimental father and son bonding moments. The absolute second Matthew pulled back from the embrace, she stepped forward and snatched the document directly out of his hands. Her eyes scanned the legal text with intense, greedy hunger. She looked specifically at the section that named her irrevocable lifestyle trust as the sole new owner of the property. A massive, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was the terrifying smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey and secured its meal. She did not say thank you to me. She did not offer me a glass of water or ask if I was tired from running errands all day long. Instead, she looked around the kitchen with a burning, arrogant entitlement. She ran her hand along the edge of the marble island and told Matthew that they needed to take this document to the county courthouse first thing Monday morning to make it official. Then she turned her cold gaze back to me. Her voice was completely devoid of the fake sweet charity she had used at her dinner party to impress her friends. She looked at me like I was a pest taking up space in her newly acquired kingdom. She stated that since the house was now officially under her management, there were going to be some major renovations starting immediately. She told me in a sharp, commanding tone that I needed to go downstairs and make sure all my cardboard boxes were pushed tightly against the back concrete wall. She said the construction crews would be coming through soon, and she did not want them tripping over my useless junk. I nodded submissively, keeping my head bowed down. I told her I would go to the basement right now and move my things out of her way. I turned around and started my slow, humiliating shuffle toward the basement door. The very moment I turned my back, I heard her giggle excitedly. I heard Matthew laugh along with her, celebrating their incredible victory. I walked down the wooden stairs into the damp chill of the basement, but I did not close the heavy door all the way. I left it cracked open just a tiny fraction of an inch so I could hear everything happening upstairs. I sat down on the edge of my lumpy futon in the dim, flickering light, and I listened. For the next 3 straight hours, I sat in the cold and listened to Amanda dig her own grave. She was on her phone, constantly pacing back and forth across the hardwood floors directly above my head. She was calling high-end general contractors, custom cabinetry builders, and luxury interior designers. Her voice echoed loudly down the stairwell, filled with a sickening level of confidence and unearned arrogance. I heard her confidently tell a contractor that she had just acquired $1 million estate and wanted to completely gut the entire main floor before the holidays. She explicitly told a custom kitchen designer to come in and rip out the beautiful, solid cherry wood cabinets that Diane and I had painstakingly picked out together 30 years ago. She complained that they looked dated and depressing. She told the designer she wanted imported white Italian marble countertops and custom brushed brass fixtures installed immediately. She was booking thousands of dollars in emergency consultation fees and agreeing to massive initial material deposits over the phone. She was charging every single penny of it to those premium credit cards that I already knew were maxed out to their absolute spending limits. She was pouring expensive gasoline all over her own blazing financial house fire, completely convinced that the fake piece of paper sitting on her kitchen counter was going to magically pay for all of her extravagant dreams. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall and closed my eyes. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. She was spending money she did not have to demolish a house she did not own. Every phone call she made, every deposit she authorized, Every arrogant demand she barked at a contractor was another heavy nail she was driving directly into her own coffin. She thought she was building a beautiful aesthetic empire for her internet followers to admire. In reality, she was actively constructing the very stage where her absolute public ruin would take place. I heard Matthew in the background, trying to ask her if they should maybe wait until the deed was officially filed with the county before spending so much money. Amanda immediately snapped at him. She called him a coward and told him to stop ruining her positive energy. She said the house was hers now, and she was not going to wait a single day longer to make it perfect. Matthew fell completely silent, unwilling to challenge her authority. He had sold his soul and betrayed his father just to keep her happy, and now he was trapped helplessly watching her accelerate their financial destruction. I sat alone in the dark basement, listening to the endless phone calls and the arrogant laughter from above. I did not feel angry anymore. The rage had completely burned out, leaving behind a perfectly cold and tranquil satisfaction. The trap was fully set, and the bait had been swallowed whole. I just needed to sit back in the shadows and wait for the perfect moment to pull the lever and watch the entire grand illusion collapse around them. The final week leading up to Saturday was a blur of absolute chaos. Amanda had decided to host what she called her grand rebranding gala. She was going to use this party to officially announce to her thousands of internet followers that she had acquired a massive luxury estate. The sheer amount of money being spent was staggering. From the moment the sun came up on Saturday morning, my house was transformed into an active construction zone of vanity. Delivery trucks backed up into my driveway, one after another. A team of professional florists carried in dozens of massive arrangements featuring rare white orchids and expensive pampas grass. They placed them on every available surface in the living room and kitchen. The heavy scent of the exotic flowers mixed with the sharp chemical smell of the industrial cleaning supplies the maid service was using on the floors. I stood quietly in this corner of the hallway, wearing my worn-out gray sweater. I watched a professional catering company set up a massive spread of organic vegan appetizers on the marble island. They were arranging tiny expensive portions on custom slate boards. A bartender was polishing glasses behind a temporary cocktail bar they had erected right in front of the fireplace I built 30 years ago. I did the math in my head as I watched them work. Between the exotic flowers, the private catering, the professional lighting crew, and the custom decorations, Amanda was easily burning through $15,000 to $20,000 in a single afternoon. She was paying for all of it with plastic credit cards that were already pushed past their absolute limits. She was throwing the financial equivalent of a spectacular fireworks show, entirely blind to the fact that she was standing in a room soaked in gasoline. Matthew looked like a man walking to his own funeral. He was sweating heavily, his face pale and drawn. Amanda had him running back and forth to the leased luxury car, carrying boxes of party favors and expensive bottles of imported champagne. Every time he walked past me, he kept his eyes glued to the floor. He knew the $250,000 commercial loan was hanging over his head. He knew the bank was going to come calling any day now. But he simply lacked the spine to stop his wife from throwing a massive party to celebrate stealing his father from his own house. He was just a terrified passenger in a vehicle rocketing toward a brick wall. Amanda, on the other hand, was absolutely glowing with unearned power. She was wearing a beige silk robe holding her phone attached to a portable ring light. She walked through the chaotic living room barking orders at the catering staff and the florists like she was the chief executive of a massive corporation. She would stop every few minutes to record a short video clip for her followers, teasing the big announcement she was going to make that evening. She twirled around my living room, laughing into the camera lens, promising everyone a massive life update. At around 4 in the afternoon, the final preparations were being put into place. The professional lighting crew was adjusting a series of bright spotlights pointing directly at the center of the living room. That was the designated spot where Amanda planned to stand when she launched her live internet broadcast. I was slowly shuffling toward the kitchen to get a glass of water before the guests started arriving. Amanda spotted me immediately. She stopped recording and her fake enthusiastic smile vanished instantly. She marched across the hardwood floor, her silk robe trailing behind her. She did not bother pulling me aside for a private conversation. She spoke to me right in front of the bartender and the florists, treating me exactly like a stray dog that had wandered into a high-end restaurant. She looked me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust. She told me that her guests were going to be arriving in less than 2 hours. She said these were very important people, including powerful local business owners and elite internet influencers. Then she pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me in a voice dripping with condescension that I simply did not fit the aesthetic of the evening. She explained that she was going to be running a highly publicized live stream broadcast to reveal the new property. She said the camera would be capturing the entire main floor, and she could not risk having a tired old man wandering into the frame and ruining her pristine brand image. She ordered me to go down to the basement immediately. She explicitly forbade me from coming upstairs for the entire night. She told me I was not allowed to use the kitchen. I was not allowed to use the main floor bathroom, and I was absolutely not allowed to speak to any of her guests if they somehow wandered near the basement door. She told me to take some snacks down with me now and to stay completely silent until the party was over the next morning. I looked at her, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. I let a look of pathetic submission wash over my face. I nodded slowly. I told her in a quiet, shaking voice that I understood perfectly. I promised her I would not ruin her special night and that I would stay completely out of sight. I thanked her for letting me grab a bottle of water before I went down into the dark. She rolled her eyes, let out an annoyed sigh, and turned her back on me before I even finished speaking. She immediately went back to shouting orders at the lighting crew. I walked to the refrigerator, grabbed a single bottle of water, and turned toward the basement door. Every step I took felt incredibly light. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped onto the top stair. I looked back at the living room one last time. The stage was perfectly set. The lights were bright. The audience was on their way. Amanda had just demanded that I stay out of her live broadcast to protect her fake image. She had no idea that I was the one who was actually directing this entire show. I closed the door behind me with a soft click and descended into the shadows, entirely ready to wait for my cue. Down in the basement, the air was incredibly cold and smelled faintly of damp earth and old cardboard boxes. I sat on the edge of the lumpy futon and listened to the heavy thud of the bass vibrating through the exposed floorboards directly above my head. The extravagant rebranding gala was in full swing. I reached beneath the cheap mattress and pulled out the protective black garment bag I had quietly smuggled down the stairs earlier in the week. I unzipped the bag in the dim, flickering light of the single fluorescent bulb. I took off the oversized, pathetic gray sweater that I had been wearing for months. I threw it onto the concrete floor with absolute disgust. I put on a crisp white dress shirt and fastened the heavy platinum cufflinks Diane had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. I slipped my arms into the tailored charcoal wool suit jacket. I stood up straight and rolled my shoulders back. The persistent ache in my joints seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by the surging electric adrenaline of a man preparing to reclaim his territory. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The timing was absolute perfection. Above me, the loud, pretentious lounge music suddenly faded out. I heard the sharp, clear sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne glass. The loud chatter of the 50 guests instantly fell into a respectful silence. Amanda was taking the center stage. Her voice, amplified through a small portable microphone, echoed down the wooden stairwell. I walked over to the heavy basement door and stood just inches from the wood, listening closely to every single word. She was greeting her thousands of followers on the live internet broadcast. She welcomed the digital audience to her newly acquired luxury estate. She spoke with a sickeningly sweet tone, spinning a magnificent and entirely fabricated web of lies. She told her viewers that this massive house was the ultimate manifestation of her relentless hard work. her pristine aesthetic vision, and her dedication to building a high-value lifestyle. She did not mention my name a single time. She did not mention the failing technology startup her husband was running. She boldly claimed to the entire world that she had purchased the million-dollar property entirely on her own. I could hear the wealthy influencers clapping and cheering. She asked everyone in the room to raise their crystal glasses for a grand toast to new beginnings and generational wealth. Through the small, dirty window near the ceiling of the basement, I saw exactly what I had been waiting for. The sweeping, blinding glare of red and blue emergency lights flashed rapidly across the wet grass of my front lawn. Multiple heavy vehicles were pulling aggressively into the long, paved driveway, parking directly behind the expensive leased cars of her arrogant guests. I heard the loud slam of heavy car doors. I heard the synchronized crunch of heavy-duty boots marching up the concrete steps to the front porch. Upstairs, Amanda was right in the middle of her grand champagne toast. She was confidently telling her internet followers that no dream is too big if you simply have the courage to claim what is rightfully yours. Then came the knock. It was not a polite neighborly tap. It was 3 massive echoing blows against the solid oak front door that literally shook the walls of the house. It was the heavy, authoritative fist of law enforcement demanding immediate entry. The cheering upstairs died instantly. A confused, anxious murmur swept through the large crowd of guests. I heard Amanda let out a sharp, dramatic sigh of annoyance. She spoke into her microphone, telling her followers that the interruption was probably just a late catering delivery or a petty noise complaint from a jealous neighbor. She ordered Matthew to go handle the door quickly so she could get back to her important broadcast. But Matthew did not move fast enough. The 3 heavy blows struck the thick wood again, this time accompanied by a booming voice ordering the occupants to open the door immediately. I pushed the basement door open and stepped out into the main hallway. The lighting in the house was blindingly bright. Professional ring lights and tall spotlights illuminated every single corner of my home. I walked silently down the hallway toward the foyer, just as Matthew finally reached the front door. His hands were shaking visibly as he turned the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open. The cold night air rushed into the warm, perfumed house. Standing on the porch, fully illuminated by the bright exterior lights and the camera flashes of the guests, was the county sheriff. He was a massive, intimidating man, wearing a crisp, dark uniform, a heavy-duty tactical belt, and an expression of absolute zero tolerance. Flanking him on his right was Aaron Foster. My attorney stood there in a dark navy suit holding a thick leather briefcase looking exactly like a corporate predator ready to devour the entire room. Behind them, standing shoulder to shoulder on the driveway, was a professional eviction crew of 6 large men wearing matching dark blue work uniforms. They were carrying heavy-duty moving dollies and massive plastic storage bins. They stood in perfect silence, acting as a highly disciplined demolition squad, waiting for the official order to tear the aesthetic fantasy down to the bare studs. Matthew stumbled backward away from the door. All the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The expensive crystal champagne glass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, sending pale wine splashing across the expensive beige rug. He looked at the towering sheriff, then he looked at the silent eviction crew, and then his wide, terrified eyes finally landed on me. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and walked directly into the center of the brightly lit foyer. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not look down at the ground. I walked with the heavy, measured, and dominant strides of a chief executive officer stepping into a hostile boardroom. The tailored charcoal suit fit my frame perfectly, projecting absolute authority. I stopped right next to the sheriff and Aaron Foster, turning slowly to face the massive crowd of strangers occupying my living room. The reaction from the room was immediate and chaotic. The wealthy internet influencers and local business partners who had previously looked at me with deep pity during the dinner party now stared in absolute bewilderment. They clearly recognized my face, but they could not reconcile the frail, pathetic charity case they had met before with the powerful, commanding man standing shoulder to shoulder with the police. Amanda was standing in the exact center of the living room, frozen completely solid like a statue. Her expensive beige silk robe suddenly looked ridiculous and cheap. The portable ring light holding her phone was still recording every single second of the confrontation, broadcasting the disaster live to thousands of people on the internet. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at me with her eyes wide open, terrified by the sudden realization that the narrative had violently slipped out of her control. She desperately tried to salvage her pride in front of the cameras. She forced a nervous, high-pitched laugh and took a hesitant step forward. She pointed a shaking finger at me and asked the room what the joke was supposed to be. She demanded to know why her elderly father-in-law was standing at the front door with police officers. She turned to the glowing screen of her phone and tried to tell her internet audience that this was just a silly misunderstanding and a minor family dispute that was being blown completely out of proportion. She looked at Matthew and ordered him to get rid of the police immediately so she could finish her property reveal. But Matthew was completely paralyzed by fear. He knew exactly who Aaron Foster was. He saw the thick leather briefcase gripped tightly in the hand of the premier estate litigator. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that the legal document he thought had secured his financial salvation was nothing but a brilliant trap, and the steel jaws had just violently snapped shut around his legs. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to be heard over the nervous murmurs of the crowd. I spoke with a deep, resonant authority that carried perfectly across the silent room. I told Amanda that the live broadcast was actually a wonderful idea. I told her that I wanted her thousands of followers to witness exactly how a self-made millionaire deals with arrogant parasites who attempt to steal his property. The word parasite hit the room like a physical shockwave. Several wealthy guests gasped aloud in shock. People instinctively took a step back, pulling their own cell phones out of their purses to record the spectacular disaster unfolding in front of them. The grand illusion of the elegant rebranding gala was completely and permanently shattered. The beautiful floral arrangements, the custom marble tables, and the expensive organic catering suddenly looked like the pathetic stolen props of a desperate fraud. The county sheriff stepped fully into the bright foyer, his heavy boots echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. He did not care about the flashing cameras or the aesthetic lighting. He looked directly past me and locked his eyes onto Amanda. He held a thick metal clipboard in his hand. He asked her in a loud, commanding voice to confirm her legal identity. As she slowly nodded her head, her face pale with rising panic, the sheriff turned his cold gaze to Matthew. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from confusion to absolute suffocating dread. The professional eviction crew standing on the porch adjusted their grip on their heavy moving equipment, their eyes aggressively scanning the expensive luxury furniture Amanda had purchased with my money. The countdown had officially reached 0. The silent adjustment was over, and the public execution had finally begun. The sheriff looked down at his heavy metal clipboard and asked Amanda a second time to state her full legal name for the official public record. Her voice was barely a trembling whisper when she finally answered him. The absolute arrogance she had displayed for the last 6 months was entirely gone completely, washed away by the blinding red and blue lights flashing through the front windows. Aaron Foster stepped forward, standing perfectly straight under the bright artificial ring lights of the film set. He set his heavy leather briefcase onto the expensive marble console table Amanda had recently purchased with my stolen money. The sharp metallic click of the brass locks opening sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. Aaron reached inside and pulled out a crisp white document. It was not a fake quitclaim deed. It was an official court-ordered 30-day eviction notice stamped by a federal judge. I took the document from Aaron and walked slowly toward Amanda. The camera on her phone was still recording broadcasting this entire disastrous moment to every single person who followed her fake aesthetic lifestyle. I stopped right in front of her. I held the eviction notice up high so the camera lens could capture the bold black lettering at the very top of the page. I looked directly at her wealthy influencer friends standing frozen in the living room, and then I looked straight into the glowing camera lens. I introduced myself to her digital audience. I told them my name is Lawrence Barrett, and I am the sole legal owner of this $1.2 million corporate estate. I looked at the glowing screen of her phone and could see the digital comments scrolling past at lightning speed. Her followers were demanding to know what was happening and asking if the entire luxury house tour was a massive scam. I made sure to speak clearly and directly into the expensive microphone she had set up. I told her thousands of viewers that the pristine luxury lifestyle they were watching was completely funded by predatory credit cards and elder financial abuse. I told them that the woman standing before them in the silk robe had forced me to sleep on a lumpy futon in an unfinished, damp basement, while she spent my money on exotic flowers and imported marble tables. I handed the paper to Amanda. Her hands shook so violently that she could barely hold the single sheet of paper. I informed her that she had exactly 30 days to remove herself and her massive mountain of consumer debt from my property. I pointed to the professional eviction crew standing on the front porch, waiting in the cold. I told her that if she was not completely gone by the end of the 30 days, those 6 men would come back and physically throw every piece of her beige furniture onto the street. The influencers in the room began whispering aggressively to one another. One woman in a pale designer dress actually covered her face and hurried toward the coat closet, clearly terrified that her own social brand would be ruined by association. Amanda looked down at the official court seal on the eviction notice, and a quiet, pathetic sob escaped her throat. The queen of the castle had just been legally reduced to a trespasser on live television, but I was not finished. The demolition was only half over. I turned my back on Amanda and walked over to my son. Matthew had backed himself into the far corner of the room, standing right next to the 3 wealthy local businessmen he had been trying to impress all night. These were the powerful men he claimed were going to invest in his technology startup. They were watching the entire scene unfold with expressions of deep concern and growing anger. Aaron Foster walked up beside me and handed me a much thicker stack of legal papers bound tightly in a dark blue folder. I looked at the boy I had raised. He looked absolutely terrified. He knew he was completely trapped. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I held the blue folder out and pressed it firmly against his chest, forcing him to take it. I spoke loud enough for the 3 businessmen to hear every single syllable. I told Matthew that he was officially being served with a civil lawsuit for severe financial fraud and identity theft. I watched the faces of his potential investors turn completely pale. I explained to the room that my highly successful son had secretly taken out a $250,000 commercial loan for a bankrupt business. I looked directly at the 3 investors and explicitly warned them to check their own corporate ledgers. I told them that a man who is willing to forge the signature of his own elderly father to secure $250,000 from a predatory secondary lender will absolutely not hesitate to steal from his business partners. I broke down his lies right there in the living room. I told everyone that his technology startup had 0 operating capital and was running a massive negative balance. The polished, successful entrepreneur act was nothing but a pathetic smokescreen to hide a desperate, drowning man. The businessman standing closest to Matthew immediately stepped away from him, as if my son were suddenly contagious. The investor set his crystal champagne glass down on the nearest table and shook his head in absolute disgust. He told Matthew that their business relationship was permanently terminated and walked straight toward the front door. The other 2 businessmen followed right behind him, completely eager to distance themselves from a man who was about to be investigated for federal wire fraud. Matthew dropped to his knees. His legs simply gave out under the crushing weight of his absolute exposure. He knelt on the expensive rug, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his champagne glass. The thick blue folder containing the lawsuit spilled open on the floor, revealing the undeniable forensic accounting reports and the blown-up images of his amateur forgery for the entire room to see. He clutched his face and began to hyperventilate. He tried to speak, but he just stammered incoherently. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, silently begging me to stop the public execution. But I simply adjusted my silk tie and looked back at him with a perfectly cold expression. I reminded him that he was 34 years old. I told him that I had spent my entire life protecting him from the consequences of his actions, but tonight he was finally going to learn how the real world treats a thief. Amanda watched her husband collapse onto the expensive rug, and her mind simply snapped. The reality of the situation was too massive and too devastating for her fragile, narcissistic ego to process. She refused to accept that her beautiful aesthetic empire was burning to the ground in front of her wealthy friends. She let out a piercing, theatrical scream that echoed off the high ceilings of the living room. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled at the top of her lungs that I was a liar. She turned frantically toward the glowing screen of her phone, which was still securely mounted on the tripod and broadcasting to thousands of people. She begged her audience not to listen to me, claiming I was just a bitter, delusional old man who was jealous of her success. Then she turned her furious gaze toward the county sheriff. She demanded that he arrest me immediately for trespassing and harassment. She proudly threw her shoulders back and announced to the entire room with absolute conviction that she was the sole legal owner of the property. She screamed that she had the legal paperwork to prove it, and that I had willingly signed the house over to her. She turned around and sprinted toward the marble kitchen island, her beige silk robe fluttering behind her. She aggressively snatched the brown manila envelope off the counter. She marched back into the bright lights of the foyer, holding the envelope high in the air, like a magnificent shield that would magically protect her from the consequences of her own greed. She pulled out the thick premium legal paper and shoved it directly toward the chest of the sheriff. She yelled that the quitclaim deed was right there with my signature and a certified notary stamp. She demanded that the sheriff throw me out of her house immediately so she could finish her rebranding gala. The sheriff did not even reach for the paper. He simply looked at Aaron Foster. Aaron adjusted his tailored navy suit jacket and took a slow, deliberate step forward. He reached out and gently took the document from her trembling hand. The room was so quiet that the crisp rustle of the thick paper sounded incredibly loud. Aaron did not look at the document because he already knew exactly what it was. He held it up to the bright ring light and looked directly at Amanda. His voice was deep calm and carried the terrifying heavy weight of a federal courtroom. He spoke clearly, making absolutely sure that the portable microphone picked up every single syllable he uttered. He addressed her by her full name. He told her that the piece of paper she was desperately clinging to was completely and utterly worthless. Amanda contorted her face in a mask of pure rage. She argued back, insisting that the signature was mine and the notary seal was completely authentic. She claimed the transfer of the estate was a done deal. Aaron smiled a very thin, cold, and predatory smile. He looked directly into the camera lens, broadcasting his voice to her entire digital following. He explained the fatal flaw in her grand criminal plan. He told the silent room that a person cannot legally transfer the ownership of a property they do not own. He revealed that exactly 4 hours before I signed that useless piece of paper, the entire $1.2 million estate had been legally transferred into an impenetrable blind corporate trust called the Barrett Legacy Foundation. He explained that I was simply a legal tenant of that corporation. He told her that when I signed her little document, I did not own a single blade of grass on the property. The color began to drain from her face, but Aaron was not finished. He turned the document around and pointed a long, steady finger at the bright blue notary stamp at the bottom of the page. He informed her that the seal was a novelty desk toy purchased from a joke shop. He told her that the entire document was a carefully constructed decoy designed specifically to catch a thief. Amanda took a stumbling step backward. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. She looked around the room at her influencer peers. They were staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, completely horrified by the massive scandal unfolding in front of them. Several of them were actively deleting their own recorded videos from their phones, desperate to erase any digital evidence that they had attended a party hosted by a fraud. Aaron lowered the paper and delivered the absolute final blow. His tone shifted from a calm explanation to a sharp legal indictment. He stated clearly for the official record that attempting to file a forged or fraudulent quitclaim deed with the intent to steal a massive real estate asset is a Class C felony under state law. He spelled out the legal definition of criminal real estate fraud and aggravated identity theft. He looked her dead in the eye and told her that by proudly presenting this forged document to a sworn law enforcement officer on a live internet broadcast, she had just provided undeniable physical evidence of her own felony crime. The sheer magnitude of her mistake finally broke through her delusion. The fake wealthy persona completely evaporated. She was not a successful lifestyle influencer. She was a broke, desperate woman who had just confessed to a major felony on live television. The county sheriff stepped forward and completely took over the scene. He pulled a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from the back of his tactical belt. The metallic clinking sound cut through the silence of the room. He informed Amanda that she was officially a primary suspect in an active federal fraud investigation. He told her that he was confiscating the fraudulent deed as direct material evidence and that detectives would be contacting her shortly to formally process the charges. He warned her not to leave the city. Amanda completely shattered. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the hardwood floor right next to her sobbing husband. She grabbed her phone from the tripod with shaking hands, desperately trying to turn off the live broadcast. She fumbled with the screen, but her fingers were trembling so violently that she dropped the expensive device onto the floor. The camera lens pointed straight up at the ceiling, capturing nothing but the bright glare of the spotlights. But the microphone continued to record every single pathetic sob and gasp for air. Her digital empire was burning to ash in real time as thousands of people typed out their absolute disgust in the comment section. The investors who had been standing near the front door had heard enough. The moment Aaron Foster used the word felony, they did not simply walk away. They practically ran down the driveway toward their luxury vehicles, eager to escape the radioactive blast zone of my son and his wife. Matthew watched them leave. He watched his entire future evaporate into the cold night air. He realized that he was not just bankrupt and publicly humiliated. He was going to face federal investigators for the $250,000 loan fraud, and his wealthy business partners were going to be the prime witnesses against him. The sheriff turned his head and gave a sharp, silent nod to the professional eviction crew waiting on the covered porch. The 6 large men stepped into the brightly lit foyer. They did not hesitate. They dropped their heavy plastic storage bins onto the expensive rugs and immediately began dismantling the aesthetic fantasy. They moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency. One man grabbed the massive, exotic floral arrangements and dumped them unceremoniously into a black garbage bag. Another man began wrapping heavy moving tape around the expensive imported marble coffee table. They were stripping the house bare. The total, instantaneous collapse of the antagonist's facade was absolute perfection. In less than 10 minutes, the arrogant queen and her cowardly king had been completely stripped of their stolen wealth, their fake social status, and their freedom. They were kneeling on the floor of my home, surrounded by police officers and movers crying over the broken pieces of their own greed. I stood perfectly straight in the center of the room, buttoning my tailored suit jacket. I watched the magnificent destruction of their arrogance, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound and total peace. The Sunday morning sun broke through the small, dirt-streaked basement window, casting a pale gray rectangle across the cold concrete floor. The massive estate above me was completely and utterly silent. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that always follows a violent storm. The extravagant caterers were gone. The flashing police lights had vanished. The professional eviction crew had done their job with ruthless efficiency, taking every single piece of beige aesthetic furniture and leaving the main living room completely barren. I had not slept a single minute during the night, but I did not feel tired. Instead, I felt an incredible, weightless clarity. The suffocating burden I had been carrying for the last 6 months was entirely gone. I pulled a single dark leather travel bag from underneath the wooden stairs and placed it gently onto the lumpy futon. I began to pack my belongings. I did not take very much. I had absolutely no intention of hauling cardboard boxes. I folded a few crisp dress shirts, my leather shaving kit, and the framed silver photograph of Diane that had been sitting in the dark since the day I was banished down here. I placed each item into the leather bag with slow, deliberate precision. As I zipped the inner compartment shut, I heard the heavy basement door slowly creak open. The wooden stairs groaned under the weight of slow, dragging footsteps. I did not look up from my packing. I knew exactly who it was. Matthew walked into the dim, flickering light of the basement, and he looked absolutely destroyed. His expensive tailored shirt from the rebranding gala was heavily wrinkled, untucked, and stained with pale wine. His eyes were severely bloodshot, and his face was bloated and swollen from hours of crying. He looked exactly like a frightened little boy who had just woken up from a terrifying nightmare. But there was no loving mother here to comfort him this time, and I was completely done playing the role of the endless provider. He stumbled toward me and collapsed directly onto the cold, concrete floor right next to my boots. He reached out and grabbed the edge of my wool trousers with shaking, sweaty hands. The sour smell of stale champagne and raw panic radiated from his skin. He started to sob loudly. It was not a quiet, dignified expression of genuine remorse. It was the loud, pathetic wailing of a coward who finally realized there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. He started talking so fast his panicked words blurred together. He immediately threw his wife to the wolves. He swore to me that the entire forged deed was her idea from the very beginning. He claimed she had relentlessly manipulated him into taking out that massive commercial loan, and that she had constantly threatened to divorce him if he did not provide her with a flawless luxury lifestyle. He begged me to believe that he never actually wanted to hurt me or steal my home. He pleaded with me to call Aaron Foster and reverse the corporate trust paperwork. He begged me on his hands and knees to use the equity in the house to pay off the bank before the federal investigators arrived at his office on Monday morning. He promised he would pay me back every single penny if I just saved him from going to a federal prison. I let him cry. I stood there perfectly still and allowed him to completely exhaust his pathetic list of excuses. When he finally ran out of breath, I reached down and gently pried his trembling fingers off my clothing. I looked down at him with an expression of absolute freezing detachment. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm. I told him that a 34-year-old man does not get to blame his wife for his own lack of a moral spine. I reminded him that Amanda did not hold a weapon to his head and force him to forge my legal signature on a $250,000 federal banking document. Amanda did not force him to stand in my kitchen, looking me right in the eye, and lie to my face about city tax forms. He made those choices completely on his own because he was too weak to admit to the world that his business was a catastrophic failure. I told him that I had spent my entire adult life working myself to the bone to build a massive safety net for him. I paid his expensive college tuition in full. I gave him a beautiful house to live in rent-free. I gave him every single advantage a father could possibly provide to a son. And he took those incredible advantages and used them to dig a hole so deep and so dark that it was finally going to swallow him whole. I told him that bailing him out now would not be an act of love. It would just teach him that he could betray his own family and face absolutely zero consequences. He reached out for me again, crying harder than before, begging for just one more chance. He asked me where he was supposed to go and how he was supposed to survive without his credit cards and his fake company. I reached down and grabbed the heavy brass zipper of the leather travel bag. I pulled it shut. The metallic sound was incredibly final, echoing loudly in the small concrete room. I picked up the bag by the thick leather handles. I looked my son dead in the eye and told him that his survival was no longer my responsibility. I stepped around him, leaving him sobbing violently on the cold basement floor. I began walking up the wooden stairs without looking back a single time. The Sunday morning sun broke through the front windows, casting a pale, bright light across the cold, hardwood floor. The massive estate was completely and utterly silent. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that always follows a violent storm. The extravagant caterers were gone. The flashing police lights had vanished. The professional eviction crew had done their job with ruthless efficiency, taking every single piece of beige aesthetic furniture and leaving the main living room completely barren. I had not slept a single minute during the night, but I did not feel tired. Instead, I felt an incredible weightless clarity. The suffocating burden I had been carrying for the last 6 months was entirely gone. I walked into the center of the empty living room carrying my dark leather travel bag. I found Matthew sitting on the floor, leaning heavily against the brick fireplace. He looked incredibly small. His knees were pulled up to his chest, and he was staring blankly at the polished wood beneath his feet. He heard my footsteps and slowly raised his head. His face was a mask of absolute despair. He looked around the empty room and then looked up at me. He opened his mouth and tried to appeal to my emotions one final time. He told me that he had absolutely nowhere to go. He said his bank accounts were frozen, his investors had abandoned him, and the federal authorities were going to be looking for him by tomorrow. He called me Dad and begged me to tell him what he was supposed to do next. I set my leather travel bag down on the hardwood floor. I did not kneel down to his level. I stood tall and looked down at the boy I had spent 34 years protecting. I told him that asking me what to do was the exact problem that had led him to this miserable empty room. I explained that for his entire life he had used my money, my patience, and my home as a giant, comfortable cushion to break his every fall. I told him he had never actually felt the cold, hard ground of reality because I was always there, standing right underneath him, ready to catch him. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of any parental warmth or lingering anger. I delivered the brutal reality check he had desperately needed for a decade. I told him that a real man does not sit in a damp basement and let his wife humiliate his father. A real man does not forge signatures on federal banking documents to cover up his own spectacular failures. I told him that his entire adult life had been a carefully constructed lie funded by the sweat of my brow and the kindness of my heart. I said he had traded his integrity for a fake luxury lifestyle, and now the bill was finally due. He started to cry again, burying his face in his hands. He asked me if I was really just going to walk away and let him go to federal prison. He pleaded with me to hire Aaron Foster to defend him, claiming he would do whatever it took to make things right. I shook my head slowly, even though he was not looking at me. I told him that Aaron Foster works exclusively for me. I explicitly stated that I was not going to pay for his criminal defense attorneys. I was not going to post his bail money when the authorities inevitably came to arrest him for wire fraud. I told him that I was officially withdrawing my protection completely and permanently. I said the safety net was gone, and he was finally going to have to face the devastating consequences of his own terrible choices. I told him that going to prison might actually be the very first honest thing he does in his entire adult life. He looked up at me, completely stunned by the absolute coldness of my words. He realized in that moment that all his tears and all his apologies were completely useless. The endless well of my fatherly forgiveness had permanently dried up. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not break eye contact with my son as I dialed a number I had memorized years ago. The call connected after 2 rings. I spoke clearly into the receiver, addressing the premier luxury real estate broker in the city. I told her my name and gave her the exact address of my $1.2 million property. I told her that the house was entirely vacant and ready for immediate showing. I instructed her to list the property on the open market today and to sell it to the highest bidder as quickly as possible. I told her I did not care about the memories or the sentimental value of the walls because the house meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Matthew stared at me in absolute horror. He understood exactly what that phone call meant. I was not just kicking him out of the house. I was completely erasing the physical foundation of our family history. I was burning the bridge to the ground and salting the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. I picked up my leather travel bag by the heavy handles. I told Matthew that he had exactly 1 hour to collect whatever clothing he had left and get off my property before I called the police and had him arrested for trespassing. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on my son and walked toward the front foyer. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the bright, warm morning sunlight. I did not look back at the empty house. I walked down the driveway toward my truck, feeling a profound sense of absolute liberation. The heavy chains of obligation were finally broken, and my new life was just beginning. 6 months have passed since the morning I walked out of that empty house. The bitter cold and the damp, musty smell of the unfinished basement are nothing more than a fading memory now. I am sitting on the expansive private balcony of my penthouse condominium. It is located in a highly exclusive luxury community for active adults in southern Florida. The mid-morning sun is incredibly warm against my skin, and a gentle ocean breeze carries the faint, salty scent of the Atlantic Sea. I am wearing a comfortable linen shirt and lightweight trousers. There are no heavy wool coats or oversized gray sweaters needed here. There are no laminated rules stuck to my stainless steel refrigerator. There are no curfews, and absolutely no one telling me when I am allowed to occupy my own living space. The $1.2 million estate sold in exactly 11 days. It was purchased entirely in cash by a wealthy retired doctor who loved the classic cherrywood cabinets and the original architectural design. The money from the sale was immediately transferred into my private wealth management accounts, adding to the massive fortune I had already secured. I never looked back. I did not leave a forwarding address for the post office. I instructed Erin Foster to legally block any and all communication attempts from my former daughter-in-law or her desperate family members. Erin did inform me of the immediate fallout. When the federal investigators raided the failing technology startup, they found absolute financial ruin. Amanda immediately turned on her husband, providing written statements to the police in a desperate and pathetic attempt to secure immunity. The investors who witnessed the confrontation in my living room eagerly testified against my son. The collapse was absolute and totally inescapable. I spend my days exactly how a man who worked for 40 years should spend them. I play 18 holes of golf on a pristine emerald green course every Tuesday and Thursday. I read thick historical biographies in my private study. I drink expensive imported coffee on my balcony, and I watch the luxury yachts sail slowly across the sparkling blue horizon. I am completely surrounded by people who respect me for the man I am not, for the bank account I represent. My health has improved dramatically. The constant aching in my joints has vanished completely, replaced by the vibrant energy of a man who has reclaimed his absolute autonomy. I reach out and pick up my porcelain coffee cup, taking a slow, deep sip of the dark, rich roast. The world is perfectly quiet. Then the absolute silence of the morning is broken. My smartphone rests on the smooth glass surface of the patio table. It begins to vibrate violently. A low, persistent buzzing sound echoes against the thick glass. I do not rush to pick it up. I slowly lower my coffee cup and turn my head to look at the bright, glowing screen. The caller identification does not display a familiar name. It displays a long, automated number originating from the county correctional facility back up north. Directly beneath the number, the automated system identifies the caller as a public defender. It is Matthew. He is allowed one phone call. He is sitting in a cold, concrete room wearing an orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his tailored suits and his fake corporate pride. He is staring at a heavy steel door, realizing that his wife has abandoned him and his friends have entirely forgotten his name. He is calling the only man who ever truly loved him. He is desperately hoping that the father he betrayed will magically swoop in, pay his massive legal fees, and rescue him from the catastrophic ruins of his own life. He is hoping for the safety net. I stare at the glowing screen, watching the phone vibrate across the glass table. I do not feel a sudden surge of paternal guilt. I do not feel a lingering sense of rage. I do not feel any desire to answer the phone and scream at him or demand an apology. I feel absolutely nothing. It is a profound and beautiful emptiness. It is the ultimate peace of absolute detachment. The boy I raised died the moment he handed me that forged legal document in my kitchen. The man sitting in that jail cell is a complete stranger to me. I do not owe that stranger my money, my time, or my peace of mind. I promised him that the safety net was gone, and I am a man who always keeps his promises. I have learned the hardest lesson a father can ever learn. True family is built on respect and loyalty, not on the blind obligation of shared blood. I lean back in my comfortable chair and cross my legs. I pick up my coffee cup again and take another slow, satisfying sip. The warm, dark liquid tastes like absolute freedom. I do not press the red button to decline the call. Declining the call requires an action. It requires acknowledging his existence and letting him know that I am actively rejecting him. Instead, I simply sit there in the warm Florida sun and let the phone ring. I watch the screen flash brightly against the glass table over and over again until it finally goes completely black. The buzzing stops. The gentle sound of the ocean waves crashing against the distant shore fills the silence once more. The silent adjustment is fully complete, and my kingdom is finally my own. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We are often taught to endure disrespect from our own family under the guise of loyalty, but true family is built on mutual respect and never on exploitation. Silence in the face of betrayal is not weakness. It is the ultimate canvas for calculated preparation. When you finally realize your kindness is being weaponized against you, you have every right to withdraw your protection and let gravity do its work. Do not ever let anyone mistake your patience for powerlessness. If you have ever had to cut ties to protect your own dignity, share your experience in the comments below. And do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of absolute justice.